Daniel chapter 6. Faith in the lion's den. The unstoppable power of a trusted God. Daniel 6 is a testimony of unshakable faith, divine protection, and the ultimate triumph of integrity over systemic corruption. Even at 80 years, Daniel faces fiercest trial not with fear but with the same consistency that defined his life. When the world conspires against you and the law is twisted to trap you, remember, no pit dug by man can swallow a person protected by God. Daniel's story proves that a political trap is just a stage for a divine miracle. Excellence that inspires leadership. Verses 1 to 3. Rising above the crowd. The standard of excellence. Verses 1 to. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. This was the Medo-Persian Empire under Darius the Mede, freshly victorious over Babylon, 539 to 538 BCE. To govern such a vast and newly conquered kingdom and to safeguard the empire's wealth and stability, Darius required a strong administrative system to guard against corruption and financial loss. Daniel was part of a high-level leadership trio responsible for overseeing the 120 satraps, highlighting his continued influence even under a new Persian administration. Satrap was a Persian administrative title for a provincial head. The word comes from the old Persian word Kshatrapavan, meaning protector of the province, the magnetism of excellence. Verse 3. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. In the midst of many powerful administrators and satraps, Daniel's excellence was a magnet that drew the king's trust. His reputation for wisdom, faithfulness, honesty, and an excellent spirit was so undeniable that the king considered placing him over the entire realm. God's favor produces visible distinction. Daniel's devotion to God shaped his work ethic, and his work ethic became his testimony. Integrity that provokes jealousy. Verses 4-5. The unblemished extraordinary resume. Verse 4. Daniel's excellence made him both favored and targeted. His integrity and competence were so consistent and uncompromising that his enemies could find no fault in his work or character. This verse reveals the 2 pillars of professionally excellent living. 1. Integrity, marked by no corruption. 2. Competence, marked by no negligence. Because these pillars were so strong, his rivals uncovered 0 scandals. His records were spotless, his loyalty beyond reproach, and his life beyond accusation. This is a powerful testament of Daniel's character. Even under the scrutiny of his enemies, his professional and personal life was found to be blameless. And so, if they were to bring him down, they would have to invent a crime, one that has nothing to do with his ethics and everything to do with his God. A hostile audit, weaponizing your strengths. Verse 5. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it is something to do with the law of his God." The word finally signifies the end of failed investigation and the start of a desperate strategy. Finding Daniel legally and professionally perfect, his rivals realized that his only vulnerability was his absolute obedience to a higher power. In the ancient world, the king's word was law. However, for Daniel, the law of his God was a supreme authority. The enemies knew that if they could create a situation where the law of the land of Persia contradicted with the law of the God of heaven, Daniel would choose God every single time. They weren't attacking a weakness, they were weaponizing his predictability. By deciding to attack the law of his God, these men unknowingly stepped out of the political battle and into a spiritual one. They shifted the fight from the satraps versus Daniel to the satraps versus the creator of the universe. The edict of death, the manipulation of power, verses 6 to 9. The architecture of the trap, verses 6-7. The enemies of Daniel understood that to catch a man of integrity, they had to manipulate a man of power. Verse 7. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a lion's den. They approached King Darius with a display of false unity, claiming that all the officials have agreed. A blatant lie, as Daniel, the chief administrator, was never consulted. Their strategy was clear: use flattery and peer pressure to manipulate authority. By exploiting the irrevocable nature of the Medo-Persian law, they convinced the king to sign an edict that made prayer illegal except to himself, effectively turning the king's throne into an altar. Notice the shift in the enemy's tactics. In chapter 3, the decree for the fiery furnace was fast, public, and brutal. Here, it is legal, deliberate, and procedural. It was a trap built on political calculation and systemic manipulation. However, they failed to realize that a trap built on a lie cannot stand against a life built on the truth. The sealed trap, the law of no return, verses 8-9. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. The enemies of Daniel were masters of the legal system. By invoking the law of the Medes and the Persians, they trapped the king in a corner where even he could not reverse his decision later. Their intention was clear: to make Daniel's destruction both legal and inevitable. Blinded by flattery and administrative pressure, the king unknowingly signed what seemed like the death warrant of his most trusted administrator. The officials believed that they had used the king's own hand to shut the door of Daniel's future, but they miscalculated one crucial truth: what law makes final, heaven can make loose. When circumstances appear signed, sealed, and delivered for your defeat, remember this: our God specializes in overturning what the world calls final. The signature of an empire means nothing when the savior of the universe steps in. The defiant prayer, the unshakable routine, verses 10-11. The edict was signed, the ink was dry, the lions were waiting, but Daniel went home. He opened his windows, bent his knees, and prayed, not in secret, not in fear, but exactly as he had done before. He refused to let the king's signature change his spiritual routine. 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night, Daniel paused the world to see heaven. He did not pray because he was in trouble. He prayed because he was in a relationship. By opening his windows toward Jerusalem, Daniel transformed his private devotion into a public testimony. Facing Jerusalem was an act of hope, anchoring his prayers in God's covenant and promises. Daniel teaches us a timeless lesson. When you cannot change your circumstances, you must change your posture. Get lower so God can rise higher. Daniel prayed just as he had done before, revealing that his public courage was fueled by a private and disciplined intimacy with God. Do not build a prayer life for a crisis. Build it before the crisis, so that when the crisis comes, you are already standing on solid ground. Where were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? This story takes place roughly 65 to 70 years after the fiery furnace of Daniel 3. Historically, the 3 friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were likely dead or retired by Daniel chapter 6. The trap springs, locked in by the law. Verse 12. The enemies of Daniel were precise in planning and ruthless in intent. They did not begin with Daniel's name, they began with the king's ego. By asking, "Did you not publish a decree?" they forced King Darius to reaffirm his own authority, leading him into a trap and publicly committing him to a penalty. Their strategy was clear and cruel: to make the king choose law over conscience and allow authority to overpower mercy. They were confident in the finality of the Persian law, a decree that could not be repealed. But remember this truth: what the world calls repeal proof is never God proof. Daniel's rivals thought that they had the final word because they had the king's signature, but they did not realize that they were merely setting a stage for a power that operates above the law of the Medes and the Persians. The king's dilemma and the prophet's peace, verses 13 to 15. The audacity of consistency, verse 13. Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." The satrap satrap's strategy was to devalue Daniel in the king's eyes. They didn't refer to him as a chief administrator, they called him one of the exiles from Judah. They tried to use his past and his background to diminish his present position. This was not merely an accusation, it was a deliberate act of character assassination. By framing his devotion as paying no attention to the king, they stripped him of dignity, loyalty, and belonging. They took his greatest strength, that is his unwavering faithfulness to God, and reframed it as a political rebellion. They twisted his worship into a treason. They took what made him excellent and made it look like a threat. The sunset of human effort. Verse 14. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. King Darius realized that he hadn't signed a law of loyalty, he had signed a death warrant for the man he most respected. Darius spent the entire day until sundown exhausting every possible avenue to deliver Daniel. Darius was the most powerful man on earth, yet he was greatly distressed by his own signature. He had the title, the throne, and the army, but he was legally locked out of saving Daniel. It's a striking picture of human power reaching its limit. This perfectly illustrates the tragic tension that occurs when politics collides with justice. To understand why King Darius was greatly distressed, we must understand the shift in political culture between the two empires, Babylon and Persia. Babylon in Daniel 3 was an absolute monarchy. The king's word was the law. If Nebuchadnezzar changed his mind, the law changed instantly. It was a system of bow or burn where power was enforced through political spectacle and fear. The king was above the law. However, Persia in Daniel 6 had a legalistic imperial system. Here the law was higher than the king. Decisions were slow, procedural, and irreversible. Power was exercised through documents, seals, and decrees. Persian politics says, sign or you are trapped. Darius was greatly distressed because he wasn't just fighting a person, he was fighting a constitutional reality. Under the law of the Medes and Persians, even the king was a prisoner to his own decree. This highlights the brilliance of the trap set for Daniel, making even the king powerless. The wall of legalism. Verse 15. The officials used the king's irrevocable law to silence his mercy. The satraps weren't just attacking Daniel, they were imprisoning the king's conscience with his own signature. They were right about the law, but they were wrong about the Lord. They saw an unchangeable decree. God saw an opportunity for an undeniable miracle. The night when the seal of man met the power of God. Verses 16 to 23. The testimony of a consistent life. Verse 16. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. This verse pulls us into one of the darkest pauses in the scripture, a night when earthly power stood helpless. Darius' statement, may your God, whom you serve continually deliver you, reveals that Daniel's consistency was his greatest sermon. He didn't just serve God when it was easy, he served continually. Live so consistently that even your critics would expect God to show up for you. The finality of the world's seal. Verse 17. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. The stone was sealed by the king and his nobles, the high-ranking aristocrats and blue bloods from the 7 elite families of Persia. The king sealed it as a symbol of royal authority, and the nobles sealed it as a symbol of state confirmation. They wanted to lock out divine intervention and make the sentence legally irreversible. The phrase, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed, is the world's way of saying it's over. It signifies the absolute end of human hope. The world saw a closing ceremony, a stone, a seal, and a death sentence. However, God was busy preparing a grand opening for Daniel. The contrast of peace versus power. Verse 18. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. Look at the striking contrast in the palace. Darius, the absolute monarch, he had the crown, the palace, and the authority, yet he had no peace. Lions were symbols of royal authority and execution, yet the lion's den was quieter than the king's bedroom. The silence of the night is not the absence of God. While the world is restless with guilt or worry, you can sleep in the den of your trials because the one who keeps you neither slumbers nor sleeps. Your trial isn't the end of the road. It's a sanctuary where God reveals his dimensions. The voice from the dark. Verses 19 to 21. Verse 19 starts, the first light of the dawn. In the Bible, the dawn often symbolizes the arrival of God's deliverance after a night of weeping. The king doesn't just walk, he hurries to the lion's den. He's caught between hope and despair, asking the question that the whole world still asks today. Is your God able? When God overrules the appetite. Verse 22. My God sent his angel and he shut the mouth of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king. Daniel's response is the ultimate testimony. Rather than complaining about his enemies or the king's weakness, he focuses entirely on God's intervention. He reveals that even when the world walks away and the stone is sealed, he is never alone. God sent an angel. The miracle wasn't that the lions disappeared, but their nature was restrained by a higher authority. They remained hungry and dangerous, yet God overruled their appetite, proving that he doesn't always remove the threat, he simply removes its power to hurt you. The morning without wound marks. Verse 23. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. The king's overjoyed reaction marks the beautiful transition from the mourning of the night to the dancing of the morning. When Daniel was finally lifted out, the evidence of God's power was undeniable. No wound was found on him. Not a scratch, not a scar, not a single mark of the enemy's fury. He didn't just survive, he emerged completely unharmed and totally preserved. This is a supernatural shield in action. Your enemies may have the teeth to tear you down, but without heaven's permission, they cannot even leave a mark. When God reverses the verdict. Verse 24. This verse reveals a sobering spiritual principle. The trap you dig for others is often the pit you fall into yourself. In the dramatic reversal of fortune, the same lions that acted as house cats for Daniel became instruments of execution for his accusers. This wasn't because the lions were suddenly hungry. It was because the restraining order of heaven had been lifted. The speed of their destruction, occurring before they even hit the floor, proves that the lions were always capable of killing. Their restraint with Daniel was purely a miracle of God's authority. The decree that shook the empire. Verses 25 to 27. The universal reach of the king's voice. Verse 25. Darius begins his proclamation with a tone of benevolence that contrasts sharply with the life-threatening tension of the previous night. By addressing every language and nation, he transforms Daniel's private miracle into a public movement, issuing a decree that demands universal recognition of God's supreme power. The theological decree, the authority of the living God. Verse 26. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is a living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, his dominion will never end. In a stunning reversal, the king who once signed Daniel's death warrant now issues a document declaring God's unlimited jurisdiction. The king confesses that while his own reign is bound by time and geography, God's power is eternal and absolute. If the law of the Medes and Persians was irrevocable, what happened to the first decree when this new one was issued? Although the initial law, triggered by Daniel's rivals, remained technically on the books for the remainder of its 30-day window, it lost all practical power to harm when Daniel came out alive. Because Medo-Persian law was irrevocable, the king could not simply delete the first decree. Instead, he issued a superior proclamation that prioritized the authority of the living God. By doing so, the king's new decree effectively superseded and overruled the old one, rendering the initial death warrant a dead letter in the face of the second, higher and royal mandate. The testimony of rescue. verse 27. King Darius moves from abstract theology to concrete evidence. He praises God not just as a concept but as a savior who actively performs signs and wonders in both the heavens and the earth. He concludes his decree by pointing to the living proof of Daniel's miraculous rescue from the power of the lions. The promotion after the pit, verse 28. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. This verse reminds us that God's reward is often long-term endurance crowned with lasting influence. Faithfulness may place you in the den for a night, but it positions you for authority across seasons and empires. Daniel did not merely survive one king, he prospered under two, a proof that God's favor is not tied to a regime, a system, or a season, but is anchored in a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Faith that outlives the den. Daniel was not just protected in the den, God sustained him there. He emerged without the smell of the pit or the scars of the struggle because his trust was deeper than his danger. The lion's den is not your destination, it's your demonstration ground. Empires change and laws fail, but the Lion of Judah has the final word. When you live with integrity in the light, God will personally defend you in the dark. Stay consistent, stay faithful, stay on your knees. The den is temporary, but your God is eternal. When God decides to protect you, the matter is settled. No decree can reverse it. No lion can override it. No enemy can overturn it. Your night will end and your morning of favor, influence, and lasting impact is already on the way.